We're going to get started now. People might still trickle in, but let's get going. Before we do, though, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we're meeting on today. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present and acknowledge that cultures and traditions of knowledge sharing have occurred on this land since long before the university was built. Sovereignty was never ceded. Today, we're going to hear from Doctors Astrid, Lorange and Andrew Brooks, who will be speaking on art, settlement, property and abolition. Astrid is a senior lecturer in the School of Art and Design at UNSW Sydney, where she teaches contemporary poetry, art and gender and cultural studies. She's the author of How Reading is Written, a brief index to Gertrude Stein. With Andrew Brooks, she co-wrote Homework, a book of essays published with Discipline in 2021. Her most recent poetry collection, Raw Materials, is forthcoming with Adalos Press. Her research looks at documentary practices in contemporary poetry and art and their remediation of state archives. She is a co-founder of the Infrastructural Inequalities Research Network, alongside Liam Greeley and Andrew Brooks, one half of the critical art collective Snack Syndicate with Andrew Brooks, and an editor of Rosa Press, also with Andrew Brooks.
Too much.
Andrew is a lecturer in the School of Arts and Media at UNSW, whose work investigates the political economy and aesthetics of media, culture, and technology, with a particular focus on infrastructure, race, social movements, policing, and abolition. He is a co-director of the UNSW Media Futures Hub, a founding member of the Infrastructural Inequalities Research Network, a co-editor of the publishing collective Rosa Press, and an affiliate investigator with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making and Society. He's also the author of the poetry collection Inferno, published by Rosa Press in 2021. Please save your questions for the end, where we'll have a Q&A, followed by some drinks in the courtyard if you'd like to come to that as well. Everyone, please welcome Astrid and Andrew.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation to be here and do this seminar. It's lovely to be here. So we're going to give a paper that is called The Aesthetics of Unmaking, which is part of a book project that we're working on at the moment on the relationship between art, abolition and settlement. The work kind of extends and builds upon some work we've been doing over the last few years on policing and abolition in the context of the settler colony of Australia, including with Liam and some others. Okay, and we're going to pass this paper backwards and forwards, paragraph by paragraph, in a very overly integrated way, let's say.
The idiom, the long arm of the law, refers to the capacity, if not inevitability, of the police to find its targets. Since the police is both an institution and the people who do its work, the long arm finds meaning both figuratively and literally. When a cop grabs, restrains, tackles, or kills someone, they do so with their arms. When cops enforce the law or act in excess of it, they do so with the power afforded by the law's monopoly on violence, that is, its arms. When the cop hails a person on the street, interpolating them as a subject of the state, the arm extends into voice. Hey, you. Arms, in other words, signify law's enforcement and the embodied forms enforcement takes.
In Vincent Namatjira's 2014 painting, Albert Namatjira convicted of supplying alcohol, long finger of the law. Two police officers are shown flanking the elder Namatjira in a scene of arrest and containment. One holds out a wonky hand, the knuckle leading to the index finger, enormous and bulging. The index points to Namatjira, whose eyes are painted as fixed on the accusatory gesture. Behind them, a second officer holds Namatjira's left arm, poking his head over the artist's shoulder to witness and therefore affirm this moment of interpellation, this moment in which the reach of settler law is literalized by the four harmonized arms of two police officers.
This scene, we can assume, restages the arrest of Albert Namatjira, who was charged and imprisoned for the crime of supplying an Aboriginal person with alcohol. The context for the arrest can be traced in legal terms to the newly federated nation state at the turn of the 20th century and the exclusion of Aboriginal people from its franchise, an exclusion that rendered them effectively non-citizens. Over the decades that followed federation, explicitly racist, paternalistic and/or assimilationist state and federal legislation worked in different ways to uphold and extend discrimination against First Nations people. By the 1950s, there was a movement seeking the overturning of discriminatory legislation and the granting of unconditional citizenship to Aboriginal people. As Wells and Christie write, this movement focused on Namatjira for a period, and in 1957, he and his wife Robina were granted citizenship apparently free from all discriminatory legislation, a decade before the 1967 referendum, which saw the conferral of voting rights to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The granting of this exceptional citizenship was based on a presumption that exemplary Aboriginal people would demonstrate the success of assimilation into settler culture and would, at the same time, reap economic benefits of expanded rights before the law.
The Namatjiras, as so-called full citizens, were allowed to buy and consume alcohol in the Northern Territory. Australian law until 1967 prohibited other First Nations people considered wards of the state and subject to discriminatory legislation from doing so. After buying alcohol for people in his community in Arrernte, Namatjira was arrested and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Following public campaigns and court appeals, the sentence was upheld but reduced to 3 months detention in Papunya. He served 2 months and shortly after he was freed on humanitarian grounds. By this time he was very ill and he died shortly thereafter.
Vincent Namatjira's painting of his great-grandfather is one in a series that shows Albert Namatjira's ambivalent status in the context of the settler state that simultaneously marked him as the ideal Aboriginal subject and the excluded other of the nation in a moment of ascendant assimilationism and economic aspirationalism. In these paintings, known as the Albert series from 2014, we can see the various contradictory gestures that constitute the conferral of and exclusion from state forms of recognition and protection that Albert Namatjira was subject to. These gestures, symbolic though they are made real through performative speech acts and the embodied acts that are indivisible from them. In other words, they are gestures, again, in both figurative and literal senses. Unsurprisingly, these paintings turn on the subtle signatures traced by hands. For example, the interlocked hands of Albert Namatjira and Queen Elizabeth, the handing over of a boomerang to a uniformed pair of cops in a scene of commerce that serves as the inverse of the arrest we opened with, and fittingly, the artist's injured hand. And then the long finger of the law.
What is the long finger of the law? If the arm represents that which connects the law and the violence required to secure its authority, what is the finger for Vincent Namatjira? We might read the finger as the extremity of the arm, the terminal point at which the law is enacted through actual physical gestures that yoke symbolic authority and material violence. The finger is the threshold between the law and specific acts of its enforcement. It is the boundary between what enables a police officer to act and the acts that constitute policing itself. The finger represents the forms of law enforcement that operate through bureaucracy, or at least emphasises the continuity between physical and administrative forms of violence. The settler claim, as we will go on to discuss below, is founded on the interrelation of fraudulent legal entitlements that require enforcement. The finger indexes the specificity of this enforcement, and the strange and fatal intimacy of its enactment is a persistent subject for Vincent Namatjira, who understands the performance of settler sovereignty as ultimately violable and volatile.
If we follow the long finger of the law backwards from federation to settlement and forwards from federation to our present, we find policing to be foundational to the ongoing project of settler colonialism. In Namatjira's painting, the long finger of the law extends with the force of actual and symbolic violence into a point. But what does the long finger of the law point at? On the one hand, it points at a man disciplined by the institution charged with preserving social order. And on the other hand, the finger points at an Arente man whose sovereignty lies beyond the authority and reach of the settler state, a man whose sovereignty cannot be brought within the reaches of settler law because it both precedes and exceeds it. Follow this long finger of the law, and it might lead us to abolition.
What then is abolition a call for? The most direct response might be to say that abolition is a program of struggle that sets its sights on the end of policing and prisons, those repressive arms of the state that inflict violence in the name of social order. This, at first glance, seems straightforward. Abolition has a clear target around which to mobilise collective action, even if such mobilisation continues to send ripples of shock through the liberal imaginary. But what happens when we look beneath this demand and consider what police and prisons do? Prisons require police who act to defend private property and preserve what has been deemed valuable. Beneath any invocation of police and prisons lurks the reproduction then of the capital relation. And with capital comes the intensification of the dispossessive world-making project that is colonialism.
To trace these nested relations between prisons, police, capital, and colony is not to flatten the specificity of contemporary abolitionist organising that targets the concrete and often death-dealing violence of policing and incarceration, or mobilises opposition to state promises of the continual expansion of these infrastructures. Rather, it is to emphasise that the state's armed institutions emerge from and remain integral to the reproduction of colonial capitalist social relations. To frame abolition in these terms is to foreground that it is a revolutionary program. The abolition of police and prisons is dependent upon the abolition of capital and colony. Or as Stefano Hani and Fred Moten put it, the object of abolition is not so much the abolition of prisons, but the abolition of a society that could have prisons, that could have slavery, that could have the wage, and therefore not abolition as the elimination of anything, but abolition as the founding of a new society. The project of unmaking this world inevitably leads us toward the open question of how to make a different one. As the abolitionist organiser Tabitha Lean puts it, abolition is a verb. How then do we unmake this society? And what futures do they require us to envision and build? What do movements to abolish look and feel like in the present? How are such struggles registered in art and culture? What role does art play in the making of different futures?
We want to address these questions by proposing an aesthetics of unmaking. Unmaking names the process of refusing completion and implies a temporality that looks simultaneously into the past and toward the future. Unmaking insists that what has been made can be unmade. The verb works to remind us then of the historical contingency of this world, the simple and undeniable fact that things have not always been as they are and so may be different once again. And yet the idea of the made suggests something far more stable than we mean to imply. Capital and colonial relations do not exist as a set of coherent policies produced by the coordination of state and parastate institutions. They are not preordained. While such relations are driven by internal and automatic logics, they unfold processually as a series of shifting and often contradictory movements, not simply a totality, but a moving totality. Unmaking then takes that which is made, in our case, colonial capitalism, itself to be an unfolding process, albeit one that is often spoken about as if it were fixed and predestined.
Our emphasis on an aesthetics of unmaking constellates around three crucial concepts: feeling, judgment, and sociality. To read with an attention to the aesthetics of unmaking is to consider how resistance to the moving totality of colonial capitalism and the always present threat of policing and incarceration, so integral to its perpetuation, is perceived, felt, and evaluated in ways that both index and generate social relations. Aesthetic experience is never singular, but always enacts relations with others. Yet it should also go without saying that aesthetic experiences do not stand outside of the circuits of capital. Indeed, capital itself is aestheticized, mobilizing forms and judgments in the service of establishing new terrains for the extraction of value.
Aesthetic experience then reflects existing social relations while simultaneously offering moments for such relations to be collectively felt. And aesthetics of unmaking registers the effective dimension of the capitalist mode of production and settler colonial rule, such as dissociation, registers the effective dimensions of these things, such as dissociation, denial, anxiety, fear, rage, fatigue, and disempowerment, and the way that these totalizing structures come to govern social life. It indexes the contingency, the incoherence and the mess of these structures, as well as the way that this mess comes to appear as stable and immovable. In drawing attention to the mess of the colonial capital relation, a mess of its own making, as it were, we want to draw attention to the many different ways that people are in the process of unmaking it as well. Such an aesthetic then contends with the ambiguous affects that arise from the unraveling of what has come to be naturalized under colonial capitalism: dispossession, private property, alienation, impending ecological and economic catastrophe. Art is one, though by no means the only site, where an aesthetics of unmaking finds the ground for continued material exploration and contestation.
What is art and where does it belong? Let's start with Paul Chan, from whom we borrow these two questions. Like the perfect crime or a bad dream, Chan writes, it is not apparent how all the elements come together. In a work of art, the parts do not make a whole. Instead, what art ends up expressing is the irreconcilable tension that results from making something while intentionally allowing the materials and the things that make up that something to change the making in mind. This dialectical process compels art to a greater and greater degree of specificity until it becomes something radically singular, something neither wholly of the mind that made it nor fully the matter from which it was made. It is here that art incompletes itself and appears.
To consider this description from the perspective of one who comes to engage with an artwork, the reader in the broadest sense of that word, cannot reconcile what is irreconcilable in the artwork. The parts do not make the whole. What we apprehend when we encounter a work of art is an index of the dialectical process through which it was made. We come to register something then about the material conditions of art's production and the specific qualities of an artwork as an object through which we perceive the social. And yet the disunity of the artwork exceeds both the conditions of its productions and its specific qualities. And it does so in two ways. Firstly, the work of art emerges through an interplay of materials and processes in excess of what an artist intends or an audience interprets. In this sense, an artwork signifies beyond its stated meanings and associations. It is incomplete as a perceptible object and incomplete because its capacity to signify continues indefinitely. Secondly, the work of art is an unusual commodity because its value is not directly tied to the quantity of labor that has gone into its production, a point we'll elaborate on below. As such, the art object is not governed by the dependent relation between labor and value that determines the capitalist production. It is a part that does not conform to the logic of the whole, and in doing so retains the possibility of incompletion even when it enters circuits of exchange. Art requires us to make sense of its appearance as something radically singular and incomplete. Because we cannot come to know what an artwork finally is or does, art is beyond reason, or even perhaps against it. What is required in order to make sense of art is something like what Walter Benjamin called the material imagination. That is, the capacity to perceive the deformation of what has been formed. The material imagine apprehends the world in perpetual movement. Indeed, it apprehends the world itself as a process of unending dissolution and therefore undergoing constant and continual transformation. For Benjamin, the material imagination asks us to attend to the decomposition of the given in order that we might register and contribute to the process of things becoming otherwise. The work of art offers an engagement with this transformation in process, extending from a historically grounded materialism toward as yet unrealized futures that depend upon the activation of the imagination.
We can speak of the artwork in our historical conjuncture as a specific thing, even if its specificity comes with almost infinitely possible forms. The work of art is an aesthetic form that is something which in its perception elicits judgment. This judgment, while it is felt as individual and personal, nonetheless finds its expression in speech acts that are addressed to another, the general other or some other in particular. Insofar as aesthetic forms yoke the subjective and intersubjective registers, and insofar as the work of art can be thought of as an aesthetic form, it is irreducibly social. And per Chan, the inverse is true too. The social is irreducibly material. So far, this is a relatively straightforward rehearsal of aesthetic experience as it has been articulated and reconfigured in the centuries following Kant. Kant's use of the term sensus communis, which describes, or communis, I never know where to emphasize that Latin, which describes the attunement of judging subjects to one another, as Sian Nai puts it, has become a guiding concept for understanding what is shared and shareable about perception. We choose to read sensus communis against its literal translation as common sense, and for its evocation of that which it shares a common root, commons, the commune, and yes, communism.
It is vital to note that, of course, not all aesthetic forms are artworks, far from it. What makes the work of art specific, as well as historically contingent, is its participation in the broader social institutions of art that mark it as a particular kind of aesthetic form in a given time and place. Additionally, the artwork has a peculiar relationship to the capitalist mode of production that has granted it an exceptional status in relation to the commodity. And by extension, art an exceptional status in relation to capital per se. The work of art, therefore, can be said to be an aesthetic form with a specific social character that is ambivalently related to the material conditions in which it is produced, circulated, and consumed. This is true of all artworks, even when they are made, as it were, in private and never enter the circuits of exchange managed by a market.
The social institution of art is characterized by a certain self-reflexivity. Art becomes such when it participates in the social institution through identification or disidentification. Sometimes art is such because it claims to be and therefore demands that what we recognize as art responds to the claim. And sometimes art is such because it is read to be and therefore the demand is made on its behalf. In both cases, what is and can be art is in part determined by what is not. This inside-outside dialectic, as we will see, both indexes and mimics the relationship between art and capitalism. We approach the artwork as a general category and art as a large and unruly world. But we are most interested to go back to Paul Chan's definition in the incompleteness inherent in the work of art, that which betrays its status as an aesthetic form in which the conditions of its production and the social meanings that emerge from its apprehension are at odds, irreconcilably contradictory. More than that, we focus primarily on artworks that treat this incompleteness directly in some way or another. This is what we mean by an aesthetics of unmaking.
Let's dwell for a moment on the relationship between art and capitalism. For at least 100 years, the story of art's commodification has been variously and anxiously rehearsed. According to one telling of this story, art finds itself in the impossible situation of being always already incorporated into capitalism insofar as mature capitalism has cultural markets powerful enough to absorb anything into its machinery. Sometimes, in response to this story, it is argued that there remains something about art that contains the radical potential to refuse the terms of its incorporation, and therefore art is capable of meaningfully resisting capitalism. That something is usually to do with its uneasy status as a commodity, its unwillingness to look, act like and circulate like other commodities under capitalism. As others have pointed out, this story and its counter story each identify some things correctly, but neither get to the most interesting parts of what is specific about art and what its specificity can tell us about capitalism.
The work of art is an exceptional commodity because artistic labour does not generate value in the same way that labour generates value in most other sectors of capitalist production. While works of art are the product of labour, their exchange value is disconnected from the labour time involved in their production. One of Marx's great interventions into the labour theory of value was to assert that value arises not from the individual labour time congealed in a single commodity, but by the socially necessary labour time required to produce commensurate commodities. Marx explains, socially necessary labour time is the labour time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labour prevalent in that society. Commodity exchange proceeds on the basis of this presumed equivalence, but because the work of art is unique, it lacks this equivalence and so is a commodity that stands adjacent to a generalised value theory of labour. When an artwork is exchanged for money, the exchange is not predicated on the logic of socially necessary labour time, but rather on a set of more or less incommensurable monopoly rights, as Daniel Spalding writes, which mark the artwork as an unreproducible and singular thing.
For John Berger, the relationship between art and capitalism must be analysed by considering the absolute constraint on the former by the logic of private property that underwrites the latter. In 1967, Berger gave an account of the artwork as a possession and the love of art as a proprietary form of consumption, as a product of capitalist modernity. The work of art in the age of capitalist production, he determines, is oppressive because it cannot oppose its status as property. Writing more than a decade later, Berger returns to this topic with a slightly different forecast. I quote, "There is an absolute incompatibility between art and private property. Property must be destroyed before imagination can develop any further." Berger's earlier articulation of the artwork as property becomes a call for artworks against property. The Berger of 1979 sees the destruction of private property as necessary for an imagination that can conceive of, let alone make, art otherwise. In the first position, art cannot be property, and in the second, in the first position, art cannot but be property, and in the second, art cannot be property. Across the two positions, Berger's conviction remains the same. Private property must be abolished. For the sake of our inquiry, we are interested in Berger's invocation of destruction as a means for the future of art. And we suggest that this might be another way to describe an aesthetics of unmaking.
Capital comes dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt, wrote Marx in his account of so-called primitive accumulation that concludes Volume 1 of Capital. In these final chapters, Marx describes the inauguration of the capitalist mode of production as dependent on acts of violent dispossession. His account seeks to pull the curtain back from classical economic mythologies that narrate the emergence of capitalism, unveiling the violence that was a precondition of the transition from feudalism. Satirizing such origin myths, Marx writes, "Long, long ago, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. Thus it came to pass that the former sought accumulated wealth and the latter sort finally had nothing to sell except their own skins." Against this naturalization of dispossession that such myths perpetuate, Marx argues that the birth of capitalism depends on a form of accumulation that precedes capitalist accumulation, an accumulation not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but its starting point. This accumulation is always violent, underpinned by invasion, occupation, murder, and theft. It is accumulation by dispossession, expropriation by brutal force.
In Marx's account of primitive accumulation, capitalism is conjoined to colonialism. The former depends upon the latter. The capitalist mode of production relies upon colonial conquest and the enclosure of indigenous lands, the enslavement of people to extract value from those lands, the birth of the public debt and the credit system, and the separation of the labourer from their own means of subsistence. His analysis emphasised this final point, stressing that primitive accumulation was a historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production via enclosure and force, and centralising the means of production in the hands of an emergent capitalist class. This process of separation thereby leaves the labourer with no option but to sell their labour power in exchange for a wage. Here, primitive accumulation describes the accumulation of materials and resources that enable the capitalist mode of production to begin, as well as the process of proletarianization, which ensures that there is a ready labour force that is structurally compelled by the mute compulsions of this emergent relation. Focused on uncovering the fundamental dynamics and automatic movements of capital, Marx's analysis relegated this form of accumulation to history, suggesting that it was a phase surpassed by the emergence of capitalism proper.
But so-called primitive accumulation, as many theorists before us have pointed out, does not fade away. Violent forms of dispossession and expropriation remain integral to the ongoing reproduction of capital. This we can see in events such as the destruction of 2 ancient rock shelters in May 2020 by the multinational mining company Rio Tinto at Juukan Gorge in the Pilbara region of Western Australia, sites of cultural significance to the traditional custodians, the Putu Kunti Kurama people. The move, a unilateral expression of violence against people and country, was protected by a legal process under Western Australian state law called a Section 18 notice, which allows land users such as mining companies to make applications for permission to destroy or impact upon registered Aboriginal heritage sites. The use of force and the legal infrastructure of the settler state cooperate to destroy relations between land and people in order that capitalist accumulation can continue. In ongoing primitive accumulation, the state plays a central role, especially in settler colonies where competing claims to sovereignty exist.
Yellowknives Dean scholar Glenn Coulthard has broadened the conception of primitive accumulation by taking dispossession rather than proletarianization as the central analytic frame. Coulthard argues that the violence of primitive accumulation directly enables the dispossession of First Nations people from their traditional lands, a process that includes deculturation, wherein Indigenous people are forcibly separated from the relations and obligations given in and by place. In the invasion then of Indigenous lands, the primary motivation of the coloniser is not the transformation of First Nations people into a waged labour force, although this of course does occur as part of that process, or sometimes occurs as part of that process, but the expansion, the primary motivation is the expansion of territory and the claiming of resources therein. Writing in the context of the Canadian settler colony, Coulthard explains, and I quote, "Following the waves of colonial settlement that marked the transition between mercantile and industrial capitalism, native labour became increasingly, but by no means entirely, superfluous to the political and economic development of the Canadian state. Increased European settlement combined with an imported, hyper-exploited non-European workforce meant that in the fur trade period, Canadian state formation and colonial capitalist development required first and foremost land, and only secondarily the surplus value afforded by cheap Indigenous labour."
Coulthard's account of primitive accumulation holds in the settler colony now called Australia, the establishment of which was largely driven by the British need to find a new dumping ground for a rapidly expanding surplus population produced by the process of proletarianisation at home. No longer able to send this convict population to the US following the American War of Independence, Britain established the settler colony of New South Wales, where convict labour would be set to work to transform the rugged outpost into a burgeoning pastoral economy. The colonists had ready-made access to an indentured and cheap labour force in the form of convict labour, rendering First Nations peoples a largely surplus population to be eliminated or managed. Of course, the practice of state-making is messier than such structural observations allow, and historical records show that enslaved, indentured and coerced Indigenous labour was a necessary supplement to imported convict labour in the making of the colony. The point is that the expropriation of land rather than labour was the primary driver in the Australian settler colony, and this violent accumulation of land continues into the present as an engine of contemporary accumulation. We might also note that primitive accumulation in the settler colony is inextricably bound to racialisation, which can be understood as the production of race through diverse and shifting acts of ascription. The justification of land expropriation and the imposition of settler sovereignty, conditions for the flourishing of capitalism, rely upon the production of racial hierarchies, and the negation of Indigenous ways of living.
For Coulthard, an emphasis on dispossession informs Indigenous resistance. He writes, the theory and practice of Indigenous anti-colonialism, including Indigenous anti-capitalism, is best understood as a struggle primarily inspired by and oriented around the question of land. A struggle not only for land in the material sense, but also deeply informed by what land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitative terms, and less around our emergent status as rightless proletarians.
Might this shift in the configuration of primitive accumulation also enable new conceptualizations of solidarity that take shared yet differential experiences of dispossession as their departure point? Michael Denning has argued that proletarianization itself might best be understood from the position of the dispossessed rather than from the position of the formerly free male labourer who is nonetheless compelled to enter the wage relation. Denning's analysis focuses on the steady expansion of a wageless global population over the past half century, a population surplus to the needs of capital as the material expansion of the global economy continues to wane. Unemployment precedes employment, and the informal economy precedes the formal, both historically and conceptually, writes Denning. We must insist that proletarian is not a synonym for wage labourer, but for dispossession, expropriation, and radical dependence on the market. End quote. While the colonial expropriation of land might not be driven by the desire to extract surplus value from Indigenous labour, the process of dispossession central to colonisation seeks to render Indigenous subjects wageless and radically dependent on the state, which launches a series of cumulative attacks on First Nations people, including frontier genocide, forced assimilation, indoctrination into principles of possessive individualism and private property. Those rendered surplus to the needs of capital are marked out along race, class, and gender lines, and so the contemporary expansion of wages life reproduces the racializing grammars of colonial capitalism. To focus on dispossession as the relation that binds the immiserated to one another suggests forms of solidarity that move beyond rigid identitarianism, acknowledging the shared yet differential experience of dispossession under colonial capitalism. We must be vigilant not to collapse the difference between the experiences of the colonised and the settlers who are dispossessed of the means of production. To think dispossession on these multiple registers serves to remind us of the entanglement of colonialism and capitalism.
So we speak not of capitalism or colonialism here, but of colonial capitalism or the colonial and capital relations. And here our intention is to avoid any attempt to make one term subservient to the other, as well as to avoid reductive debates over the primacy of race, class as analytic frames. Instead, we stress the inextricable relation between the two. An extension of the concept of primitive accumulation offers a way to think these two interrelated systems of domination. The settler colony of Australia is the primary site for our analysis, though our analytic approach is informed by a broad and internationalist body of anti-colonial, anti-capitalist and critical Indigenous scholarship. Our aim then is to treat Australia as a specific site of settler colonial violence and to read this specificity against the history of a world made by colonial capitalism, and also always a world in the process then of its own unmaking. This movement between the nation, state, and the world and back again allows us to perform a close reading of what an aesthetics of unmaking, that is, the art of abolition, might mean for us here and for the implied us of everywhere.
So what precisely is a settler colony? We might say in the first instance that settler colonialism is a specific kind of colonialism whereby occupying forces seek to eliminate and replace the Indigenous peoples whose sovereign territory is the central motive for occupation. The result is what Eileen Morton Robinson calls incommensurable sovereignties, that is, the ontologically irreconcilable confrontation between settler possession and Indigenous life worlds. She writes, our ontologies, our way of being Indigenous, are inextricably connected to being in and of our lands. This is an inherent sovereignty, not temporally constrained. It functions through the logics of relativity, finding expression in kin relations, respect, responsibility, and obligation that exist outside the logic of capital and familial ties to private property and nation states.
The incommensurability of Indigenous and settler sovereignties underscores settler colonial strategies of state formation and power. Structurally unable to incorporate Indigenous sovereignty within a settler framework, the state is guided by a violent logic of elimination and replacement. Rather than replacing one owner with another, as Patrick Wolf put it, settlers seek to replace an entire system of ownership with another. The settler-native confrontation, in other words, is not between claims to ownership, but between frameworks for allocating ownerships. It is between sovereignties, which are primordially external to one another. And that's the end of the Wolf quote. That Indigenous sovereignty is external to settler sovereignty poses an irreconcilable tension for the settler state. In failing to resolve this tension within its own jurisdictional institutions, the state employs varied techniques of domination to subjugate sovereign Indigenous people. And here Coulthard again offers an instructive definition. A settler colonial relationship is characterized by a particular form of domination. That is, it is a relationship where power, in this case, interrelated discursive and non-discursive facets of economic, gendered, racial, and state power, has been structured into a relatively secure or sedimented set of hierarchical social relations that continue to facilitate the dispossession of Indigenous people of their lands and their self-determining authority.
Note that Coulthard's definition recasts the settler colony not as a static thing, the result of some historical event, but as a relationship. In the settler colony, dispossession is, by necessity, an ongoing process. The territorial infrastructure of the occupying force is built on top of sovereign territories. Settlers must continue to enact occupation, to enact the possessive claim, in order to negate the very sovereignty it cannot directly acknowledge. As Patrick Wolf memorably put it, invasion is a structure, not an event. By this, he elaborates, elimination should be seen as an organising principle of settler colonial society rather than a one-off and superseded occurrence. The logic of elimination, which animates such things as frontier murder, the establishment of missions, state-sanctioned miscegenation, native citizenship, the forced removal of children from kin, rates of Indigenous incarceration, serves to legitimate the settler state and its expropriation of land through the process of ongoing primitive accumulation. In the words of Tony Birch, the series of attacks on Aboriginal people had two objectives: to destroy us and to open up land to Europeans unhindered by any Aboriginal claim.
The structure of invasion in the settler state of Australia, as Eileen Morton Robinson puts it, operates according to the possessive logics of patriarchal white sovereignty. Land is seized by force and claimed on behalf of the crown according to gendered concepts of property and ownership. Ownership is protected in turn by force, embodied in the police, military, and judiciary. This form of ownership is justified through the construction of a racial hierarchy for which whiteness is not only the ruling category, but also endowed naturally with the right to property and with rightful frameworks for the allocation of ownership. Taken together, Morton Robinson demonstrates these possessive logics simultaneously produce the social relations through which gender, race, and property are understood and regulated in Australia.
If the settler colony depends on the technologies of violence through which ownership is asserted, it also depends on the social relations and discursive formations through which such violence is natural, normal, repeated, and repeatable. In other words, for Morton Robinson, the possessive logics that underwrite the settler claim to sovereignty also underwrite common sense knowledge, decision-making, and socially produced conventions about everyday life in the colony. Possessive logics, she argues, and the disavowal of Indigenous sovereignty are inextricably linked, anchored, and regulated through race. From the settler colony as a distinct structure to Australia as a specific settler state, we can trace the particular racialized forms that possession and therefore dispossession have taken here.
What can we say about the possessive logics of settler sovereignty in Australia today? I mean, seems like a dumb question. We could say so much, but let's say something. We might trace the originary possessive claim in its reproduction across countless sites in which the state and capital interests align, in extractive industries and the devastation of sovereign country, in austere economic policy that continually diverts investment away from the social store and towards the securitization of the state, and that in turn shifts responsibility for social reproduction increasingly onto individuals and privatized family units. In the rapidly increasing housing crisis that sees an ever-widening gap between property ownership and housing insecurity, and of course in the extraordinary over-policing and disproportionate incarceration of First Nations people. We might also find it in the current debate over the forthcoming voice referendum that will determine whether or not to alter the constitution to formally recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and to establish a group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to give independent advice to the Parliament on certain issues. This last example, the voice, is perhaps the most paradigmatic of Australia today. Mainstream political discourse has fixed on formal constitutional recognition and limited parliamentary representation as the primary terms on which the debate is to be waged. Many First Nations people and organisations are rejecting these terms on the grounds that formal recognition and limited representation within the settler state is at odds with struggles for sovereignty and self-determination, and that structurally speaking, frameworks of representation and recognition can only work to affirm settler statehood, and so cannot be a path to abolition or to questions of land back or treaty. Right?
When asked what role the voice would have in advising Parliament on climate policy, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese replied that such a question was up there with the strangest he'd received yet. The voice, he explained, is about matters that directly affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Chelsea Watego responded, "Blackfellas have been on the front line of climate justice efforts, yet via the voice are meant to be voiceless on this." The referendum will turn on the fundamental question of what having a voice can possibly mean and do for First Nations peoples whose dispossession enables the very structure in which a voice might be heard, if not listened to or acted on. On the one hand, there is the issue of representation and what it both affords and forecloses. On the other, there is the issue of sovereignty and what it means to take seriously the impasse of incommensurable sovereignties. One cannot be recognised by the other, nor can one be incorporated into the other. Possessive logics work to constrain mainstream discourse on the referendum to the former, to issues of representation, as a means of shutting down discussion of the latter, treaties, land back, reparations.
Okay, we're
almost done.
We are almost there, and thank you for we've been working through, I guess, this sort of history, much of which and context for this project, much of which will be familiar to many of you already. Trying to think through this kind of relationship between colonialism and capitalism in a little bit more detail here, and trying to think here about the way that a call for abolition of police and policing might contain this kind of implicit call for the abolition of the colony and the abolition of capital. But we did promise aesthetics and art, and so we are going to finish this paper by returning to that question and trying to think that through a little bit, or trying to link some of this context to some examples of aesthetics. In the 2016-17 exhibition Sovereignty, curated by Paula Balla and Max Delaney and installed at the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art, protest banners made by the warriors of Aboriginal resistance, war, in 2014 were displayed across the wall of the gallery. One banner reads, "No climate justice on stolen land. Let's decolonise the crisis response. Sovereignty now." Can we read this banner for its articulation of Australia in the contemporary moment? The banner reimagines a familiar political slogan against settler sovereignty, "No justice on stolen land," to emphasise the inextricable relationship between colonial capitalism and environmental collapse. There can be no climate response remotely adequate to the task of mitigating catastrophe that emerges from within the settler state itself, an entity forged by the rapacious appetite for land and resources necessary for the reproduction of capitalist accumulation, or the kind of process of ongoing primitive accumulation that we have been describing in this paper. To decolonize the crisis response, therefore, would mean decolonization in its most absolute sense, the repatriation of land, the abolition of the settler state, the dissolution of private property, and more. In this context, sovereignty now can be read in at least two ways. It is a call for the unbroken sovereignty of First Nations people against the illegitimate claim of the settler state. That is, it is a call for the former as that which abolishes the latter. It is also an affirmation of the unbrokenness itself. Sovereignty now is the ever-breaking present that becomes, in its infinite extension forwards and backwards, always was and always will be. In a curatorial essay for the exhibition, Barlow writes, "Sovereignty itself is an inalienable, innate, and intimate right. Its expression can be found buried within artistic works, gently emerging from inherited practices, or boldly spelled out in new artistic forms adorned with confident lines, camouflage, electric lights, and bling. War banners continue older artistic forms associated with social movements and street-based struggles, and take up simple materials like calico, paint, and dowel. We can read them not only as artifacts of political life, but also as expressions of the aesthetic dimension of political action, and as aesthetic objects that draw on text, image, and form to connect the discrete yet no less connected threads of history and present, violence and resistance. Sorry.
Their installation in an exhibition can be understood not as an attempt to fix these banners in and as artworks, removing them from their normal life on the street and granting them a special new life in the gallery, as one might with a ready-made, but of inviting a temporary attunement to the aesthetics and poetics of the banner as a particular form in which political expression is tested and contested. We might ask, in other words, rather than how or why we can read them as artworks, how the banners tell us something about the aesthetic dimension of what is not typically art. Such a shift entails approaching the inclusion of war banners in an exhibition from the other direction, as it were. That is, with an orientation towards the idea that art as a framework for reading the world, that art is a framework for reading the world and not a rarefied world unto itself. Put another way, it is the existence of social movements that take aim at concrete material conditions in the present that animates radical artistic expression. The repeated action of shutting down the city by war, writes Balla, is such an act of courage and defiance, standing up for the rights of community self-determination and protection of Aboriginal children in detention. It is contact with these larger struggles to transform the social that powers the art of unmaking.
The material demands articulated on the banners remain unchanged whether one reads them on the street or in the gallery, even if the circumstances of reading are radically different. In this sense, the banners both emerge from the struggles that produce them and continue to shape the context in which their demands are made. Their materiality is suggestive of past and future banners, of the history and grammar of banner making, of the tacit invitation to make more, to transform slogans to new sites for intervention or proclamation. In this sense, the banners eschew the idea of a finished or final artwork in favour of the unfinished and incomplete artistic project of scoring struggle.
The aesthetics of unmaking that we are developing here requires that we rethink the relation between artistic forms and the larger struggles over the transformation of the social in a given historical moment. In our moment in the Australian settler colony, the struggles to transform the social include First Nations-led movements against deaths in custody that demand the abolition of police and prison, and the insistent calls for land back and treaties. These struggles are crystallised in the actions of warriors of Aboriginal resistance, whose militant organising can bring cities to a standstill, or in the Jabwurrung Heritage Protection Embassy, which created an infrastructural blockade between 2018 and 2020 to oppose the ongoing primitive accumulation by the Victorian state government, who sought to expropriate sovereign lands in order to build a new stretch of highway that would destroy birthing trees sacred to the traditional custodians. These are movements against the twin miseries of colonialism and capitalism and the ecological and cultural apocalypses they oversee. It is our proposition that the ground for the emergence of a forward-looking artistic avant-garde is the active social movements in pursuit of the transformation of the social totality. Radical artistic production takes its cue from struggle and not the other way around.
But we might also consider the inverse of this proposition and ask, what can aesthetics offer struggle? The noise of a mass protest or an occupation unmakes, even if momentarily, the social order. But how do we register this act of unmaking? The protest banner articulates a demand, and yet the demand is never singular. It is made and remade in countless different ways. The assertion of sovereignty is a call for abolition, a response to impending climate crisis, a refusal of dispossession, a continuation of culture, an expression of excess that evades capture. It is all of these things at once. Aesthetics then encourages an attunement to the forms that the making and unmaking of colonial capitalism take, and to the felt dimension of this dialectic, which includes rage, disempowerment, denial, anxiety, and solidarity. Crucially, aesthetics demands that we register such forms through the act of judgment, through a speech act that is addressed to another. Here we might find that aesthetics becomes a crucial site for the building of collectivity, involving, to recall Nye's reading of the Kantian concept of sensus communis that we began with, the attunement of judging subjects to one another. Aesthetics then offers one way of building solidarity. In our current conjuncture, struggles for the abolition of colonial capitalism are black-led, but the abolition of such structures can only occur through a truly collective effort. This project then is animated by such a desire, reading works by both First Nation and settler artists, as well as collectives that seek to unmake the world as we know it. In addition to Vincent Namatjira and the Warriors of Aboriginal Resistance, already mentioned here, the larger project looks at artists like Helen Johnson, Richard Bell, Ryan Presley, Bridget Chappell, Juan de Villa, and Brenda Croft, as well as actions like the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And here we propose an aesthetics of unmaking as one way of registering the complex relations between art and sociality, struggle and culture, resistance and abolition. Thanks.
So thanks so much, guys. That was amazing. And so many great images. It's nice when we get to, people do talks on art and we get to see it. It's very special. I'm just going to stop sharing. Can we all see that on the screen? Great. Is everyone still good online? You can still see and hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So maybe I can just check the chat, keep an eye on the chat. But if there are any questions in the room to kick us off for question time. While we're still thinking, I can kick us off. I was thinking as you were talking about the kind of roles and possibilities of public art as an idea, because in a sense, public art seeks to not be privately owned and is like outside of ownership of private property in some ways, but I can also see it being part of legitimizing the state, right? Because it's public, whose public is it, right? So I wonder if you've had thought much about public art or thought about different examples of public art that have been maybe better or worse than others.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I will say we haven't thought about in the specific context of this project. So I'm speaking a little bit on the fly here, but it's interesting you asked that question because I have just been talking to a Masters of Fine Arts candidate at UNSW where I teach, Nick Breeden, who just had a show open at First Draft called Public Art. And their project really turns on this question of what precisely is meant by the public in public art and in presumptions about where public art exists and who pays for it and who is paid for it and who owns, or like all of the more visible and less visible forms of property relations that underwrite public space, and that that often we don't necessarily always perceive those competing demands on space as we move through them, but certainly they're there. And if you are involved in the commission or the production of a public artwork, you certainly feel all of those those kind of possessive logics in their manifestation and also in the sort of competing demands, as I say. And I thought what was really interesting about their work was that it's installed in a gallery, so they're not public artworks per se, but all of the sculptural pieces have been made by reclaiming materials that are sort of putatively public, but not, like the MLAC keys that are kind of issued for use of public bathrooms, locks that are put on to gates in sort of symbols of private property relationships in the couple form, as well as city bike infrastructure that's been abandoned or destroyed. And I thought that was a really interesting way of inverting the notion of like, we need a more expansive and inclusive and open public art to be like, well, we need to sort of like reappropriate the actually private materials of the public into artworks for different communities. So yeah, I thought I'd just give a shout out to Nick's sculpture there. Yeah, do you have anything to add, Andrew?
No, I think that's pretty good. I mean, only to say, I suppose that like, I think, public art is in the same way that art, that sort of commercial art or exhibited art has this sort of strange and uncomfortable relationship to the commodity form and to private property. I think it exists in the same way, right? Like they are sort of conditionally public things, and they are like, they're like sort of, there is often, there is a kind of exchange going on that renders them to have some kind of like uncomfortable relationship to those things. And yet I think like public art kind of is one of those things that like, once it's there, like people can do whatever they want with it, like it can be a shelter, it can be something that's like used against its purpose in kind of interesting ways as well. So I don't know, I haven't thought a huge amount about it, but it's a great question and one to kind of ponder more, I think.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, super interesting. And is that exhibition still going, or is it?
It is actually, yeah, get down to first draft.
At first draft.
Yeah.
Cool, good to know. Any other questions in the room or on chat? Yeah, Tim, I'll come over to you. Great.
Hi both, I really enjoyed your presentation, as I always do. It was really fantastic. I guess I was just thinking about the different forms of that connection between prisons and the carceral institutions and then art and the different ways that you're making those connections. And I think my mind leaped, and this is maybe a very simple leap, to the moments where those things are placed directly in dialogue. And some obvious cases would be the use of art and rehabilitation programs within prisons, and then the use of the investment in art programs or cultural programs for perceived to be at-risk youth to keep them out of prisons. And obviously I feel generally positive towards those things because any money towards the arts is good. But I also wonder if there is something kind of complicated about those uses of art, in as much as they might leave under-examined, why is this person being rehabilitated in prison when maybe prison may not have been the best place for that person in the first place? And again, the categorization of at-risk youth. Are they at risk because of their own behaviors, or are they at risk because there's poor policing practices that over-targets them and harasses them and so on? So I guess maybe that goes on from Jimmy's question, which is just about how do we think about where art and the prison complex sit together, and when do they speak to each other, and what are the critical versions of understandings of art that might help them? Which I think your work is pointing to in really interesting ways.
Thanks so much, Tim. That's a great question. Yeah, I think there's a few things to say. I'm not sure which order to say them in. Maybe to start with kind of programs that are targeted, there to sort of intervene before one might encounter the prison system. I mean, I think also generally that's a that's a conditionally positive thing. Conditionally positive in the sense that like that effort of redirection is kind of useful. And I think anything that seeks to try to intervene before one ends up coming into contact with the prison system is a positive thing. But I do think that there's always a question there of like, under what conditions what is a program like that doing in relation to kind of larger structures of funding, right? So how is it there sometimes as a kind of band-aid solution to the expansion of policing and prison budgets that we see every time a state budget rolls around, right? So we see those things happening at the same time. We see like, well, here is a larger budget or a plan to, we are seeing the building of new prisons. We are seeing prison populations steadily growing in Australia since the 1980s. And so those investments in funding tend to dwarf the former, the sort of like rehabilitative or the community programs that are there supposedly, and not even supposedly, I think those programs are there to try to intervene before at-risk youth enter systems, right? But we have to I think we have to hold those things kind of in tension with one another. And I guess another way of asking that question is like, or reframing what you're asking is a sort of around the question of reform or revolution. And, the kind of horizon of abolition is always a revolutionary one. And the question of like what pushing for certain reforms does is a complex question. And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I do think sometimes, I think we have to work within, we have to be realistic about the systems that we're working within. And so in that sense, like how do we advocate for more programs, for the expansion of community resourcing that is about sort of harm prevention, or that is about risk, the minimization of risk, or trying to produce systems and structures and programs that redirect people away from contact with prisons and policing. At the same time, I do think there is a kind of open-ended question about what those energies do to the larger call to do away with or to abolish prisons and policing, right? When people are spending all of their energies trying to advocate for the redirection of budgets in certain ways, that is part of the kind of process, I think, of leaving intact and not even leaving intact, but also growing policing and prisons as an infrastructure. So it's a complex one to think through, and it's a really good question. The question of artistic programs in prisons, I think, also has a similarly, for me, complex response, which is to do with, I think, a kind of a legacy promise of rehabilitation in prisons that maybe sort of only conditionally correlates to what happens in prisons, right? And what we see on the other side of prisons, how successful they are as rehabilitative institutions, right? What we see often is people who come into contact with prisons having net widening and ongoing interactions with policing and prisons. So that's a kind of, again, like, it's not, I don't want to be reductive or simplistic and say, well, people in prisons shouldn't have art programs. Like, sure, that's how, that's, but I do think there is a kind of, there's a sort of, again, a question about how those programs are resourced, what those programs look like within prisons, what agency people who are incarcerated have over the direction of those prisons, and how they are framed as kind of rehabilitation programs. And I think we should think and maybe push back against the kind of framing of rehabilitation, particularly when we're talking about when we can point to all of the ways that justice systems kind of reproduce discriminatory and prejudicial behaviors, right? So we can think, well, what is the rehabilitation of what rehabilitative function could someone who's arrested for an unpaid or who spends time in prison for an unpaid fine, like what is being rehabilitated here?
I have nothing else to add to that comprehensive answer, except that I would just say, like, at a more kind of maybe philosophical or political level, like until prisons don't exist, and if we are abolitionists, we believe they shouldn't, as long as people are imprisoned, they have, to my mind, an absolute right to have access to social and cultural life. And, incarceration, the point of incarceration is the deprivation of those things. And so I think where anyone tries to where access to those things are granted, even so conditionally as they are, I think it's a really important thing to people's lives, and to, I think, the right to have some kind of engagement with cultural practice. And I would also say that the other thing about that is that people in prison do, like with or without external programs, whether state or non-state actor-led, people in prisons have robust social and cultural lives and practices. And there's that sort of really strong tradition of all sorts of, incredible works of imagination that are produced, despite all conditions to negate the very possibility of them coming into being. So I think sort of, like, I agree with Andrew, and I think when we're talking about these programs that are sort of led to try and mitigate against some of the worst aspects of incarceration, therefore to improve and in some senses extend the capacity for incarceration, absolutely we need to be critical. But at a more autonomous level of social and cultural life, I think, like, any effort to enable people in prison to have better access to those things, or to have work be shared and made public is like a really core thing that people can do, I think. Yeah.
And maybe just on that point, give a quick shout out to Nicole Fleetwood's great project on, I think it's called Making Time, maybe, which is sort of about art and culture produced in prisons.
Thanks, guys. Any other questions from in the room or on Zoom? Still got at least 10 minutes. Kane, yeah, great.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful. So I've been thinking about the really striking way you talked about making and unmaking, and sort of the very processual language you were using at that point. And I'm sort of trying to, just in my head, and maybe could you give the paper again? So, but I guess I'm trying to sort of think about that in relation to the idea you brought up from Morton Robertson about incommensurable sovereignties. And where am I going with this? I guess I wondered if you could clarify whether, when you're talking about making and unmaking, I assume you're talking about a form of making that is sort of tethered to possessive logics and property, and the unmaking that you're talking about is the detail, well, doing away with that. Is that right? And yes. And then, so the incommensurable sovereignties, I mean, that's, so because I was getting so caught up in the processual language of making and unmaking, and then thinking about, well, actually, if you think about incommensurable, that concept of incommensurable sovereignties, it's like you have this domain of, dispossession and abolition, fighting it out on the plane of white sovereignty or something, and the plane of Indigenous sovereignty, Aboriginal sovereignty. I mean, the temporality of that, I think you sort of talked about that in the paper, is But I just wondered how sort of process stuff might figure in thinking about Indigenous sovereignty.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Ken. I will. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but yeah, I think what we are interested in trying to think with this idea of making and unmaking is to, in some ways, kind of look beneath the kind of appearance of stability and when we talk about something like capital or when we talk about something like colonialism, right? And again, here to kind of, really push against I mean, it's a silly reference, but it's one I think that has some kind of endurance, this sort of idea of the end of history, this kind of permanence of these things, or like the impossibility, that kind of imagination that gets stuck by thinking about these things as immovable structures, as solid structures. And so we wanted to, in trying to kind of work through this history of the entanglement between capitalism and colonialism, and to think through the processual nature of racialization, of capital as a shifting relation, as a moving relation, of colonialism as also a shifting set of practices that enable, discursive and material practices in Morton Robinson's terms, that enable the ongoing legitimation of settler colonialism. So none of these processes are static, they're always moving. And in thinking about the way they move, we see all of these contradictions and incoherences, right? At one point, racial policy in the colony is about kind of exclusion. At another point, it's about assimilation, right? There's things that but there's a continuity between, but in kind of in sort of trying to identify the messiness of the way that these things are made, and the kind of moving them as moving relations. I think we're also trying to draw attention to the possibilities that we might pull at some of those messy threads, that they might be ways of kind of raising consciousness, organizing action, pointing to the kind of orienting kind of ways of unmaking as well. So there's a kind of, we're interested in that relation. The kind of question of incommensurable sovereignties is a really difficult question to work through, because I think the two sovereignties are incommensurable, and yet the kind of relationship of force and power is not even. There's a kind of implication perhaps when we think about the incommensurability of sovereignties. It's like, oh well, they stand parallel to one another, and so they are untouchable by one another. But of course, the actuality of power, the power relation is not an even power relation. So the kind of incommensurability of sovereignty is a reality and an abstraction. Obviously, it's an ontological reality, and yet the forces of the state are constantly working to break it, to eliminate it, to dismantle it, to bring it within, to bring it kind of as far within, or to control and discipline that sovereignty which the state knows is its kind of the thing which also troubles its foundations, right? And that's Patrick Wolf's kind of great insight about the logic of elimination, is that because these things are incommensurable sovereignties, the only way that the settler state can deal with Indigenous sovereignty is by eliminating. So that those two things, I think we have to hold together as well. We have to think, well, what is the ontological relation between these ontologies, and what is the and how does the settler state use the kind of tools at its disposal and institutions like the police and the prison to continuously try to exercise that project of not simply dismantling, but eliminating Indigenous sovereignty, because only through elimination can it be this kind of like resolution, right?
Can
I don't know if that answers your
break in for a
question.
moment? I see that Megan's got a question, and given that she got up at 6:30 in the morning, we ask it.
Please.
Sorry, I actually withdrew my question as Drew was speaking. I don't know that I can connect to such a large landscape of theoretical elaboration, but like Kane, I was interested in this question of unmaking and how we might bring into your discussion or our discussion, one of the, I guess, fundamentals of cultural studies, which is that every gaze or every act of reception is an unmaking already. And I felt this very severely when we spent a lot of time looking at a close-up of the pointing finger of the policeman. And while I absolutely understood everything you were saying about the complexity of this gesture of not only the long arm, but the pointing finger of the law, and also I could see in the curve of the joint that allusion to some conventions of traditional painting in Vincent Namatjira's work generally, the way limbs are curved rather than sort of articulated joints. Nevertheless, just looking at that policeman's finger, I cannot stop this voice in my head saying, oh God, the poor bloke has arthritis. You know, this like, and this is a like deeply personal projection, right? Because, and that was to do, again, temporality of perception. That was to do with how long I was looking at it. The longer I looked at it, the more I started obsessing about arthritis. Similarly, you know, and this is much too complicated to go into, but when we were talking about policing, my unmaking in my head of some of the things you were saying was to do with the very new and complicated issues that have come up here in France about the violence by European-wide Black Bloc anarchists against police here on the 1st of May, where there was an attempt to kill policemen and also to sideline the concerns of over 2 million protesters by having an unleashed war between the police. All of these things are in my head. So I think that's normal. That's pretty much what happens to anybody looking at images, listening to talk, if you don't have a directed professional interest in the moment. So coming to the things you were saying at the end, which I really loved, I found fascinating, about activist art and art in the streets and art in the museum. Do you think the term unmaking kind of needs a little bit of a supplement to account more for the labor of the artists who are trying, in a sense, to rechannel our unmaking? In other words, to stop me thinking about just about me and my arthritis, but a little bit more about the broader issues, so that unmaking isn't quite sufficient. I think there's a more directive energy than that in activist art. And that was the comment I wanted to put forward. Thanks.
Before you jump in, we do only have 1 minute. So
Yeah.
we may take it slightly more as a comment than a question, but feel free to jump in just for a little bit.
I just wanted to say thank you. That's so useful. And I think it's really wonderful to hear that. And I guess my response to Kane's question, which I won't go fully into because we don't have time, but would be to say that you've both, Kane and Megan, identified the problem that we encountered yesterday and couldn't resolve for today, but surely, hopefully will do for the book itself, which is that it's not enough to kind of have this direct opposition of making and unmaking. It's sort of, it's a matrix of, like, we're pointing to making and unmaking in all of these different directions and processes that are to do with, you know, the kind of false claims of naturalization and of, you know, rightness, as well as the sort of endemic crisis and moving contradictions of capital itself, as well as this sort of more processual, the open-endedness of things which are sort of like understood to be about reciprocity and responsibility. So we sort of, that's the work to be done. And thank you so much for the question and the wonderful comment, Megan, because I think that's given us, I think, some really important homework to do about how we articulate these things. So it's not just kind of like, there is the made, which is bad, and then the unmaking, which is good. And because that's also kind of course, not it's not, yeah, that's not the thing that we're doing, but it certainly is the work to be done to elucidate that.
Yeah, I mean, I just also want to say thanks for the question and also for the fantastic comment, Megan. That's, you know, I think it's also something that we are, you know, we're at the kind of outset of this project. And so it's something that Tom, who's also on the call here, pointed out to us at some point, you know, to really try to think a little bit more with the unmaking that happens in reception. And I think that's very important for us to kind of try to think about that side of unmaking as a productive and generative site, but then, as you say, Megan, the kind of the labor of the artist to direct that unmaking in some ways is so crucial. So yeah, really appreciate that comment.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for your questions, and also for the great paper and answers as well, Astrid and Andrew. Can we have one more round of applause?